try.
Sure. I mean, Eric, you used the figure of $6.4 trillion spent on the war on terror. That could have been, that's sort of the opportunity cost side that should be considered before war being launched. And you said, obviously, as I said before, the war on terror, and I quote, self-defeating, self-perpetuating, and immoral. Now, I want to bring the conversation to a more recent development, right? And that is John Bolton. Okay, so John Bolton, for those of our viewers who aren't aware, we actually did a review of his book that was released recently on the previous episode of our podcast. Sangar and I dissected the book and what it meant. And they're actually quite, I mean, right now we're finally, at long last, lo and behold, we're at the stage where there is some recognition of the need for dialogue, with President Trump approving negotiations with the Taliban. And, we're at that point. But even then, Trump, as I quoted him in the earlier podcast, is saying things like, if they, meaning the Taliban, are going to do something bad, we're going to blow their country into a million effing pieces. And Bolton, surprisingly, is the good guy here who is saying, we've already done that before.
It's a rare role for Bolton to be playing that.
Listen, Eric, I am telling you, that book for me was the emotional roller coaster, because half the time I'm thinking, damn, Trump is right. And the other half I'm thinking, damn, Bolton has a shred of humanity in him. Look at that. He's got a shred of humanity. But, with regard to the racism and the dehumanization, Trump is very clearly, despite the negotiations and the recognition for the need for it, he's saying, we're going to do this and we're going to do that. And Bolton is saying, well, actually, we've done it before and it hasn't worked. So I don't know who that is more damning of, but I want to read to you a specific quote. And this is because it's with regard to the war on terror. So Bolton writes, and I quote, "War by radical Islamist terrorists against the United States began long before 9/11 and will continue long after. You can like it or not, but it is reality. Donald Trump did not like it and acted like it wasn't true. He opposed endless war in the Middle East, but had no coherent plan for what followed, withdrawing US forces and abandoning key regional allies as the withdrawal unfolded." Now, your detractors, Eric, obviously have tried to, smear you as unpatriotic, treasonous, and whatever. But with regard to the specific point of the war on terror, how would you counter this? That, this is a reality of radical Islamic war, and whether, you or Donald Trump likes it or not, they're still going to attack. How would you address that?
It's sort of a ludicrous thought that America, a country with 330 million people that has the largest economy on earth, becomes terrified of a country that's just trying to make it by with how many people are in Afghanistan these days? 28 million?
I mean, we don't actually have statistics, but it's estimated that about 35, 36 million. Is that correct, Sangar?
Something like that.
Yeah. So that we have somehow, as a country, the richest and very large country with a military larger than the next 10 countries combined, is somehow able to rally the American people to be afraid of Afghans coming to destroy our country, when the sort of average income is hundreds of dollars per year. And I there's this sort of fear that, that has been stoked ever since September 11th, and it hasn't gone away. And it's a very irrational fear, especially when you consider that 0 of the 19 hijackers from September 11th were from Afghanistan or Iraq. Our country continually forgets that fact. None of them were Afghan, and yet we've occupied Afghanistan for 19 years. So it just doesn't make any sense to me that, Afghanistan is a national security threat for the United States, threatening us. The military of Afghanistan isn't coming over to try to bomb New York or DC. So stop it, John Bolton. What are you doing? There's far bigger risks to Americans at home, which are far more mundane, but more important, whether it be healthcare, infrastructure, climate change so that hundreds of millions of people don't eventually become internally displaced from their home due to water scarcity or food scarcity or other forms of conflict, which, by the way, the United States is the largest cumulative emitter of emissions since the Industrial Revolution beyond China. And that is the right measure to use is cumulative rather than per annum, because it stays in the environment for thousands of years for CO2. And we have the least regressive, the least progressive policies to combat that. So if we're actually looking to minimize harm to Americans and to people abroad, the notion that we should occupy Afghanistan for 19 years is just a horrible decision and wildly illogical.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is that, and I think once again, it's encapsulated perfectly by your quote about self-perpetuating. I mean, I'm not a constitutional expert on the United States, but what I understand is that when a war is launched, it needs to be launched on a specific foe. There's congressional oversight and whatever. When you launch a war against terror, okay, and terror can be arbitrarily defined, but even then, when you define it as arbitrarily as has been done, and then you use those same methods, tactics, there's very little to distinguish it. I mean, it's crazy to me that people don't see that if innocent American civilians died in 9/11, how the hell does killing innocent Afghan civilians help out on a much larger scale? And so Exactly. I mean, I don't know how many 9/11s we've had, or like you mentioned, the Doctors Without Borders thing.
Over 100 9/11s worth of civilian deaths, according to Brown University's Watson Institute across the Greater Middle East. So It's over. Their current figure is 335,000 civilians. This is not including combatants. This is civilians. So that's more than 100 9/11s.
Yeah, sure. And the thing is that the problem is that people like Bolton still are credible in the United States. And that's because, like you've experienced firsthand, the fact that the war industry, war profiteers, have a stranglehold over national security policy.
Yeah, I mean, that's very true. I mean, you can look at Robert Gates, former SecDef, and in his concluding remarks when he left that role, it was even very difficult for him. And he's the Secretary of Defense, pointing out, by the year 2020, we're going to have, an X times multiple of, stealth fighters or something above the next largest country. Why are we still spending money on these things? And there's no good reason. And I mean that. I mentioned climate change. I'll mention it just once more here, because it is the greatest threat to the world, and it is not a beardy person from the Middle East coming over with high explosives. That is not the threat. For every dollar that America continues to spend on war fighting, it is not only a dollar not spent abating climate change now, but it is a reinvestment in far larger future wars caused by climate change, because we did nothing about it when we could.
Yeah, I mean, that was pretty profound. So I'm pretty taken aback. But I mean, 100%, it's true, and I think the role of the media in this is also undeniable, because the media purports to speak truth to power and hold power to account, but then who's holding the media to account? Why is it that the bearded guy from the Middle East with an explosive vest is seen as such a threat? And, like we discussed, there's racism and everything of the sort. So, I mean, in your experience, would you say that the fact that Afghanistan is the good war or the legal war as opposed to Iraq, is that something that was just prevalent not only in the media and the political landscape of the country, but was it also something, because you mentioned that many of your classmates at West Point, they went into service with similar altruistic purposes of, doing good and helping people out. Was that, changed by their experience in Afghanistan as well? Were you sort of the black sheep in the group, or was it something of a sort of a group realization?
Lots of things there. firstly, I mean, I don't think that the war in Afghanistan is legal for occupying somebody for 19 years, and there's nowhere in Article 51 of the UN Charter or anything under international law where something like that would be permitted. So I don't think that, and it also sets a really terrible precedent as a country that you can just say, oh, we believe that you are guilty of X or Y, and therefore your entire populace should be occupied by a foreign country. If you applied those same rigorous measures, which aren't rigorous at all, to say, where in American history have we funded, some sort of uprising in a foreign country that resulted in violence and death? I mean, the Haitians, for instance, would have a good case. Lots of countries in South America would have, on the same basis that we occupy Afghanistan, a more legitimate reason for occupying the United States under those same exact moral standards. But to the point about sort of mainstream media, yeah, like asking to apply the same moral standard to ourselves and others is seen often as sort of a very lefty view.